Awesome, thanks. Hi, everybody. I am Greg Marlowe, and this is Spacing the Implied Animation Principle. And I know what you're asking right now. Who is this guy? I am an assistant professor at East Tennessee State University, where we teach digital media, and that includes animation, game design, visualization, visual effects. We also recently implemented an MFA in the fall of 2021. I am also a freelance animator, and I've been animating for about 13 years now. Primarily, most of my work has been been with Firaxis Games and other studios. I worked on the Civilization franchise, the XCOM franchise, and also did a little work on Battleborn with Gearbox and The Pathless with Giant Squid Games. And most recently, I worked on Marvel Midnight Sun, which will hopefully be launching soon. So before I begin, there are several foundational topics I want us to keep in our head throughout this talk. So let's do a quick overview or refresher of a few things to make sure we're kind of all on the same page here. Almost everything always starts with these guys, right? The 12 principles of animation. I'm sure most everyone in the room is familiar with this. If you're not, that's your homework for tonight, is to go home and study that. But we're not going to go through all of them right now, but the thing I want you to keep in mind with this is that these 12 principles were developed as teaching tools for new animators who are being hired into the studio at Disney. Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, the other 9 old men, they developed these over 40 years of observation as they were crafting the art of animation. And they were basing them off of things they saw in real life. And real life motion, of course, is rooted in force, right? Or in physics. And I know what you think when you hear physics. I'm not going to make you do any math. We just need to sort of touch on some concepts here. First, let's start with force. The knower of all knowledge, Wikipedia, says it's an influence that can change the motion of an object. A couple examples of types of forces: gravity, friction, drag, centrifugal, normal force. The normal force is why objects press against each other. So remembering those. And of course, sort of the beginnings of physics was Newton's 3 laws of motion. I'm going to drastically oversimplify those. So we have the first one is inertia, which is a body at rest stays at rest until acted upon by a force. Body in motion stays in motion until acted upon by a force. Essentially, we can sum this up as objects move and stop because of forces, right? The second one, force equals mass times acceleration, which sounds like we're going to do some math, but we're really not. It just means that small, slow things do not have very much force. Small, fast things have a lot of force. Big, slow things have a lot of force. Big, fast things have a huge amount of force, right? And of course, number 3, action and reaction. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. We also probably need to keep in mind the law of conservation of energy. This guy is Julius Robert Mayer, who kind of compiled all of the ideas that formed the law of conservation of energy, which essentially says energy can't be created or destroyed. It just changes form. Right? So the way I have to think of this is energy into a system has to be equal to the energy that comes back out of a system. And finally, the word spacing may be a little bit foreign to some people. So the idea of spacing is it's the screen space distance an object moves between frames of an animation. So we have an object that moves from here to here, and when we're talking about spacing, what we're talking about is that distance right there, right? If we sort of look at an animation with, this is an animation done by by Ollie Johnston I think this is from Lady and the Tramp. We'll notice that we have, we track the tip of this ear, we get these little dots, right? And this is, these are just locations that we can track, but when we're talking about spacing, we're talking about these gaps, like the distance these points travel from frame to frame. So good animators think about spacing a lot. They use the term daily in critiques and explanations. So if it's so important, why is it not principle number 13? Well, first, could you imagine the arrogance it would take to say, "Oh, Frank and Ollie forgot one. Let me fix it." Right? So it doesn't need fixing. The real reason there's not a principle 13 is because spacing is actually already in there. It's implied in the depth of the original 12 principles. So what we're going to do for this talk is I wanted to dive into select principles to see where the concept of spacing is hiding. Right? Just a heads up, we're not going to touch on every principle in this talk, and we are going to go through them out of order. So let's start with number 9, the principle of timing. We start with this one because these are often referred to together, timing and spacing. And so what exactly is timing? Timing is the amount of time it takes for an action to happen. It may sound like we're oversimplifying this here. But of course, in animation, we measure this in frames. And so we'll say 24 images flash on the screen for 1 second of film. Yeah, I know games, TV, film, they're all different. 30 for games or 60, 90 for VR, whatever. The essence of this, though, is fast actions take fewer frames to happen and slow actions take more frames to happen. So when we're thinking about timing, we have this object moving from point A to point B, and this action to happen in this timing just takes 10 frames of animation at 24 frames a second, right? If we had the same action and used 100 frames to make that action happen, it's a different action then, right? It's a different timing for this. And so that's what we're talking about in timing. So if that's timing, what is spacing? So again, it's the distance the object travels in one frame, but it's also the progressive change of those distances over multiple frames, right? So that same timing for those two balls we saw earlier, that may have been the timing. This is the spacing. So time is for the most part constant, right? Spacing, however, is a mechanical element of the media. So think of a shutter on a camera. It's literally just an eye opening and closing again and again, revealing a slice of time, right? So when the images are played back to back, we get this illusion of motion. And we can kind of recreate that illusion with our own eye, right? If I were to open my eye and I see a bear, right, and then for some reason decided to close my eye again, if I reopened it, I would see that bear in a different location, right? And I wouldn't assume that the original bear disappeared and a new identical bear appeared nearby. We assume, because of this illusion of motion, that the bear is moving, right? Because the idea of a disappearing, reappearing bear is terrifying. And if we continue to open and close our eyes, we get this, this change of location over time, right? So recognize that when we're talking about spacing, the distance between these two images that we would see as we open and close our eyes tell us how fast the bear is moving. So if there's a big spacing, that's a fast bear and you need to run. So principle of slow in and slow out. Interestingly, this is one of the shorter sections in the illusion of life. And I personally believe it's probably where spacing belongs the most in the 12 principles. But essentially, slow in and slow out said movements in the real world need to accelerate and slow down, right? So we have a car at a red light, the light turns green, it starts driving, and then the next light turns red and it slows to a stop, right? And we will see this acceleration and deceleration in the spacing of that motion. We have the smaller spacing at the beginning that increases as the object accelerates, bigger spacing in the middle as the car's traveling at its top speed, and then it decelerates, the spacing gets smaller again, right? However, if we had an action like this, we have this big sudden spacing at the beginning, like this large spacing, and this implies a force made the car move, right? And then, of course, the decreasing of the spacing at the end implies us gradually rolling to a stop. So this could be an explosion or a car getting rear-ended, knocking it forward. So an object at rest stays at rest until acted upon by a force. And so we're seeing the result of that force in the spacing of this object. So With this animation, this gradual acceleration at the beginning implies a car building up speed, right? So we have that ease in, but this big spacing at the end implies implies a force that causes this sudden stop. It's like it's hitting a wall, or it is, like in this case, hitting another car. So again, an object in motion stays in motion until acted upon by a force. So the principle of squash and stretch. So in The Illusion of Life, we find this illustration, and it's one of the few spots in the entire book that we see this word come up, where they say, in moving the circle representing the ball down and back up, it was discovered that the ball would seem to have more weight if the drawings were closer together at the top and spaced farther apart at the bottom. So the idea that this was mentioned in the squash and stretch section leads us to a deeper conversation about the principle. They start the squash and stretch section of the book by saying, by far the most important discovery was what we call squash and stretch. And that's a bold statement, right? That by far the most important. Squash and stretch is the first principle Frank and Ollie talk about, and that section of the book is multiple pages long, which seems a little excessive if it just means make things squishy. So it must be about more than that. So the law of conservation of energy. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It just changes form. Well, spacing is one of the ways we can see energy changing form. Right? So if we have this ball squashing and stretching, we can sort of analyze that energy and how it's where it's going. Right. So we have this force traveling down with this ball, right? And then it encounters another force, which is the ground, with a normal force. If it were hitting a weak object, it would just bust through, but energy can't be destroyed. It has to go somewhere. So some of the energy, is going to get lost to the ground through friction, vibration, stuff like that. But the energy that's left is going to get redirected through the ball. And that's why we're getting this squash that happens here, as the energy is pushed out that direction, sort of redirected back up. And then as it starts to push the energy back up this way, that's where we're going to start to get that stretch. So we also see a stretch here at the bottom because that part of the energy hasn't been redirected yet. It just catches up at the end, right? So principles of arcs. So arcs are everywhere we look. Sloppy arcs are one of the telltale signs of an inexperienced animator. And so with this guy sort of doing this turn, I'll play it again here. If we were to go in and sort of track the tips of his toes, we're going to see this series of dots that start to make up the arcs for his motion, right? Now again, it's part of the media, right? Arcs happen naturally, and it happens naturally because our bodies are built up out of pivot points, and the result of those pivots at the end of our limbs is an arc. But because we're seeing this in frame-by-frame slices, we have to realize that really what we're seeing are just a series of dots, and if we were to connect those, we're getting these straight lines. When we say arcs, it's really this implied curve that all of those dots of our spacing are making, right? So, we get this series of dots, but we see this very beautiful path of arcs that are made up out of this motion of this leg spinning around. So when we talk about cleaning up our arcs, that's where we get into stuff like this. So we get the spacing at the tip of this object. And usually when we are referring to cleaning up the arcs, we're talking about this, right? This inconsistency of the path, right? And then we, instead of seeing this jagged path, we want to turn it into this smooth path. And that's usually what people are mentioning when they say something about arcs. But I want to recognize that it also includes the spacing that is happening within that arc, right? And we see this sudden change in spacing. There was a gradual increase, but then a sudden lunge forward, and then a small spacing, and then another lunge forward. And so this inconsistency of change implies the existence of another force that is causing the change, right? Spacing along that arc should be consistent, and I want to reiterate that consistent doesn't mean linear or even. But when we see something like this, that is also what we're talking about, or what we're seeing here as well, is this implication that some other force, like the wind or something bumped the object, caused this hiccup in the arc. Obviously, if that's what you want to convey in your animation, then you use that to your advantage. But okay, principle of staging. So staging is just presenting the action in a way that's clear. So animation is just a sequence of images, right? And images are two-dimensional. So this is something that 3D animators can easily forget when they spend all day tumbling around in a 3D scene, right? That we have this angle on this bouncing ball. We can't really see very much about the spacing, but if we see it from this other angle from the side, the spacing is much more clear. So when we talk about staging, this is from the perspective of the viewer. How is it staged to the viewer, right? So with something like a baseball pitch, if we're behind the pitcher, the spacing on his arm, we will see is something like this, right? And that just doesn't really tell us the whole story of that pitch, right? And also, like, this is the entire distance that the arm travels throughout the action. If we staged this from the side and we see this action like this, this has a different spacing, and it's a dramatically different action because of that. You'll see this increase in the spacing with this large lunge forward toward the release. So, and then we also see this large area that is covered in that pitch. So staging is very important how your spacing is seen by the viewer. So straight ahead action and pose to pose. So when we talk about straight ahead action and in regards to spacing, that means we have to plan the spacing for actions that haven't been animated yet, right? If we are wanting this to ease to a stop, then I have to say, in the next 5 frames, I want this to come to a stop, and I need to gradually decrease my spacing as I'm doing that. But most people work in the pose-to-pose process in some form or another, particularly in 3D animation. And so key pose drawings give us our timing, right? Spacing is just subdividing that timing with more drawings. So, I may decide to subdivide between frame 1 and 5 with 3 and put 3 there, and then 2 there and 4 there. So how we subdivide those frames changes the action, right? And it also changes the spacing. So each of these different versions of this is going to look like a different action. It's worth noting that this is also where we get a timing chart, right? So if we look at, this is a drawing by Milk Call from the Aristocats, you can see from the timing chart that he's giving instructions to the in-betweener that he wants them to ease out of frame 40 and go fast into frame 49. So kind of back to that question, why not Principle 13? So another reason I believe is connected to technology, right? Think of the tools we're using for tracking spacing now. We use the graph editor. It does all of our in-betweenings with auto tangents, and we use ghosting, onion skinning, arc tracking, all tools that replicate what traditional animators got automatically with tracing paper and a light box, right? Spacing is innate in hand-drawn animation. You can't really create traditional animation without thinking about spacing. So 3D animation software creates spacing for us. It's up to the animator to make it good, right? So, let's talk about spacing in practice just a little bit. Motion is just change over time, right? And the graph editor is just a depiction of that. The up and down axis is change, the left and right is time. And so we are able to see visually change over time for whatever action we are creating. The graph editor the graph editor's primary reason for existing is to control timing and spacing. I really wanted to write the graph editor's only reason for existing is to control timing and spacing, but I didn't want to start a fight about that. But I honestly believe that. Like, in the end, the graph editor is about timing and spacing, and we can actually see that it's just a modern version of the timing chart, right? These are both ways of describing an action easing out with smaller space at the beginning and larger spacing at the end, right? So we can directly see how these are connected by putting this up and down motion alongside a curve, right? And we can see that this is the same timing, drastically different spacing depending on what we are, how we have adjusted this curve, right? All right, so we have an action like this. This is just a little robot car driving along. And we would describe this action as even, right, or linear timing. You can see that the spacing is exactly the same for every frame, right? So a curve for something like this would look maybe something like this, right? And you can see where we get the term linear. It's really just a straight line from point A to point B, right? If we wanted to add a little bit of resistance to this, like some mud that slows it down, you'll see that the difference in spacing is subtle, but very, very, like, you can feel it. Like, you can feel the difference in the spacing. And it's the same keyframes, again, with a slightly different curve that would cause that action to happen. So I mentioned I worked on the pathless with giant squid, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this sort of this explosion and how we think about spacing to show some physics here. So we have a fire we put out, and this explosion knocks back the boss character. But if we go in here and look at this frame by frame, we have this explosion, and you'll remember for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So from that explosion, we see a reaction in the spacing of the character's head in the very next frame. We get this big knockback, and then slowly over time we ease in to a little bit of a stop, right? So again, we're trying to convey forces here, and this is really noticeable or really leverageable when you're doing something like an attack, a punch, right? That what we are wanting to show is that force of the impact, and spacing is a really big player in how we show that. So we have this ease out of the spacing at the beginning, right? And then this increase of spacing, and we want the largest spacing distance to be right before the impact or right at the impact, right? We get this huge spacing difference for that impact, right? And I also want you to notice a small trick I'm doing here. If you watch the ball also nudges just a little bit toward the punch, right? Nobody will ever notice that watching it in real time, but we will get an increase in that pop feeling from the ball. Like, it'll make the ball pop away harder, right? And then again, like, we're just leveraging a series of images to get this illusion of motion. And so I'm going to control the spacing. If the spacing were naturally, it would be off screen in the next frame, but I want the audience to be able to see it just for one more frame, so I keep just the tip of it in there and change the spacing manually for that. So I also worked on Battleborn. I mentioned that on some NPCs with Gearbox, and there were several attack animations, throw animations, punch animations. And this had a very significant animation style. Like, it was intentionally large or exaggerated, right? And so I wanted to sort of break some of these down to show you, like, just like in that punch earlier, we get this gradual increase, but because this is a more exaggerated animation, look at the spacing distance here right before the impact. It's like half the distance of the punch. I think this is actually a throw. And then we sort of pop out of that again, and that's what gives that impact or that force to it. This ground slam, we get this spacing that's kind of similar to like a bouncing ball. It kind of eases out of the top, and then the spacing increases to get this hard impact on the ground, and then I'd do just a tiny bump up at the end to give some residual motion from that impact, because energy can't be created or destroyed. We're seeing that in this recoil. Finally, this one is sort of a strike, right? And all of this that we're seeing at the beginning is anticipation, right? Anticipation for a hit. But it's kind of a longer build-up, and I really want this to have some impact. So even though I've been anticipating for 5 frames here, I'm going to anticipate back just a little bit more to increase the distance of that spacing to make this hit really hard, right? And so that strike is just 2 frames long with huge amount of spacing with a lot of anticipation. So obviously we can, we can talk about spacing and. Let her finish speaking there. We can obviously talk about spacing in something that's a little bit more of a realistic style. Maybe not realistic, but like not quite as exaggerated. So if we look at the tip of her finger, we're going to see, this is Tamar the Great from Civilization 6. We can see this slow out here, and then the spacing increases in the middle. And then we sort of slow the spacing again, or shrink the spacing here again. And that's to let this pose read, but also to serve as a little bit of an anticipation as we, it will amplify this gesture that she makes, and this large spacing here in the middle. And it gives it a little bit more force, a little bit more energy. And of course, we sort of settle at the top up here with some smaller spacing. And then as the arm drops, we'll start to see this acceleration again with the larger spacing in the middle, and then the smaller spacing as we settle to a stop at the end, right? So the last thing I wanted to talk about is something I see with a lot of student animation, which is you have an action that you need to be slow, right? And so maybe it's 300 frames or 200 frames, and they'll set a keyframe at the beginning and a keyframe at the end, and Maya does all of this in between. And what you end up with is that dreaded critique of it looks floaty, right? That's a bad critique, because it means you're letting the computer do it for you, right? Which is what too many people think computer animation is anyway. But the solution isn't always evident to people. Spacing is where the solution is here, right? We can still have that action take that same amount of time, but if we just sort of add little breaks in the spacing, little lunges forward, we can still keep that tension without it feeling quite so floaty. Now, this totally still needs a ton of polish. This was just a quick example, but recognize that this is what understanding how to leverage spacing will help you with. So, and all this kind of brings us back full circle to one final principle, which is the principle of appeal, right? Appeal is the principle that kind of binds all of the other principles together, and I think we can all agree that floating animation is not appealing. So now we know how to fix it. So I think we have maybe 2 minutes left if we want to open it up to any questions, or if you feel free to contact me on any of these platforms.
All right, we do have 2 more minutes for questions here.
Okay.
I'm looking in the chat to see if there were any, but my chat is unfortunately super laggy.
That's all right.
Here's one from KeyFlow46. Hi, Gregory. My name is Key. I'm a student at the Academy of Art studying 3D animation. Do you have any tips or suggestions for an upcoming graduate breaking into this industry?
Wow. I only have 2 minutes on this one. So, yeah, I think it's just continue to progress forward, right? The advice I always give my students is if you continue to practice, if you continue to work at it, you're most likely going to get better, right? Right? And I think that successful people are just people who don't quit, like who don't give up. They keep working and getting further along, and I guess the that would, effort is the only thing that really matters. Like, nobody's born good at this. You have to just continue to practice and work hard at it. So I know that's not always the answer everybody's hoping for, but
It's a fantastic answer, and it was a fantastic talk. Greg, thank you so much for participating.
oh, thank you.
Wonderful job. Everybody in the chat, stick around. Up next, we've got another session of the steamroller animation. Don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.